President William Ruto no longer speaks like a man in command. He's not addressing parliament, he's not talking to diplomats, he's pleading with Gen Z protesters flooding the streets of Nairobi. His voice, once sharp and full of authority, now shakes as he begs them not to destroy their country. But they're not spreading flames. They're spreading a question. One quiet sentence, carried like wind across a continent. Why do Africans love Traore even in Kenya? The police are shouting that they've had enough. This question isn't just echoing, it's exploding like lightning through a storm. And if you've followed African politics, you know this isn't a spontaneous outcry. This is a shift, a moment of reckoning. In Burkina Faso, a young captain named Ibrahim Traore didn't just reject the IMF, he rejected fear. He left the podium behind, refused the safety of distance, and stood barefoot in the dust with his people, speaking plainly, acting fast, trusting deeply. And in Kenya, one of the most advanced economies in East Africa, it isn't the unemployed or the poor leading the protests, it's the police, the very backbone of state authority, the last line of obedience. They've stopped being enforcers. They've started becoming witnesses, refusing to be tools for a system that exploits even its own. This isn't about political parties or policies. This is a clash between two visions of leadership, one that revives a nation and one that bleeds it dry. Stay with us, because this isn't just news. It's a vision our ancestors dreamed of. An Africa that no longer bows. In July 2024, something unthinkable happened in Nairobi. It wasn't the teachers. It wasn't the students. It wasn't even the unions. It was the police, armed, uniformed, trained to obey, who marched in their thousands. And they chanted one word, loud enough to rattle the halls of power. Enough. They didn't send spokespeople. They didn't negotiate in boardrooms. Some tore off their uniforms, removed their badges, and stood unflinching in front of cameras, not resigning from duty, but from a system that betrayed them. For the first time in decades, Kenya's law enforcement publicly turned against the government they swore to protect. Why? Months of unpaid wages, slashed allowances, and a future mortgaged to IMF demands. Under President Ruto's leadership, Kenya borrowed over $9 billion from international lenders since 2021. In return came austerity, deep cuts to public wages, reduced education funding, frozen healthcare budgets, and for the police, it meant more than empty accounts. It meant humiliation. How could they uphold laws when the system had abandoned them? At that very moment, far from the headlines, in Burkina Faso, another leader was showing something else entirely. No convoys, no bodyguards, no riot gear. Captain Ibrahim Traore walked into a dusty education fair and sat cross-legged on the ground. Children, mothers, elders, no script, no entourage. Just a single line that cut through decades of noise. We don't need loan conditions. We need living conditions. There was no applause. Just silence, the kind that comes when someone finally says what everyone has been thinking. So what does it mean when the same IMF loan drives protectors to rebel in one country, but unites a community around its leader in another? What does it say when those who enforce the system become the first to walk away from it? If the police, the final barrier between order and chaos, can no longer trust the state, then what remains to hold a nation together? In Kenya, Ruto doubled down. Official statements were released. Accusations of betrayal filled the media, but the truth was already visible. When those paid to obey begin to disobey, it's not just a rebellion, it's a revelation, a warning that the social contract has cracked so badly, not even loyalty can patch it. Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, there were no protests, no slogans, just quiet acts of hope. A nurse offered weekend lessons to kids who had dropped out. A retired teacher reopened a rural classroom with benches made of old planks. No one was paid. No one was told to do it. But they came, again and again and again. If leadership isn't measured by commands given, but by actions inspired, then ask yourself, what are we witnessing? Is this governance by force, or something far more powerful, governance by example? What happens to a nation when those tasked with enforcing its laws declare, we no longer believe? And what kind of future begins to form when, somewhere else, people act not because they were ordered to, but because someone finally listened? In an era where African leaders deliver speeches from behind velvet-covered podiums, behind glass and layers of protocol, Captain Ibrahim Traore has carved out a different kind of presence, one made not of ceremony, but of red dust and shared breath. In the markets of Kaya and the village squares of Burkina Faso, he doesn't move like a man bringing answers. He moves like a man carrying questions. He gently returns to the people themselves. He never promised salary hikes. He didn't beg for aid. He didn't unveil plans for applause or sign memoranda to satisfy international donors. Instead, at a small community education fair, standing before a modest crowd, he simply said, "We don't need loan conditions, we need living conditions." That sentence, plain, unpolished, and honest, hit like thunder rolling through a silent valley. When Traore refused the International Monetary Fund's loan, he didn't just walk away from a financial agreement. He walked away from a dangerous idea, the belief that Africans must always choose between submission and survival. The reaction from the West was swift. Newsrooms in Paris and Brussels labeled him reckless. Analysts in Washington warned of disaster. Reports predicted instability, unsustainability, even delusion. But back home, in the sun-hardened towns of Burkina Faso, people heard something different. In the village of Tankaho, a woman whispered, "This is the first time a leader said no for all of us, not just for himself." And that quiet, steady no traveled faster than any official statement. Traore's leadership doesn't live on stages, it unfolds in stillness. In Sapui, he visited a rural school and turned off the only fan so that no one would suffer alone. He sat barefoot among banana farmers, seamstresses, and orphans. No camera crews, no advisors. Just one question. If you were president and had to choose, would you cut roads, diesel, or your daughter's lunch? And the room went silent, not from fear, but from understanding. This wasn't a man performing empathy. This was a man who had taken off the armor of power to ask the same questions that keep mothers awake at night. What followed wasn't written into law. It didn't make headlines, but it spread. In Ouagadougou, young bricklayers began repairing a long-abandoned maternity ward. In Bobo-Dioulasso, a tailor reopened a shuttered school, transforming it into a sewing co-op for girls. No contracts, no orders. Still, they came. So what stirs people to move when no command is given? What drives their hands when no paycheck is promised? Maybe the answer isn't in policy, but in trust. Not in institutions, but in a leader who listens, who sits beside them as one of their own. Western experts shook their heads. This can't last, they said. People need incentives. But Burkina Faso was proving something older than theory, that when belief is restored, it can carry heavier burdens than fear ever could. In Dibougou, a farmer gave away half his harvest to feed school volunteers. In Koudougou, a teenager took over an abandoned radio station to broadcast free tutoring to children in remote villages. These weren't reforms. They weren't pilot projects. They were answers born not from budgets, but from a shared spirit. And maybe, in a continent where reform usually begins in donor meetings, the real revolution begins on the ground with a single question, a quiet nod, and one moment of truth. Captain Ibrahim Traore didn't chase elite approval. He chose the harder path, honesty, and the people responded not out of obligation, but because, for the first time, they believed they were allowed to. So when he asked, "What would you cut to save your neighbor's school?" the answer wasn't fuel, or roads, or wages. The answer was, "We will cut nothing. We will build together." In Kenya, the road was clear and carefully followed. As the IMF tightened its grip, President William Ruto's administration followed the script to the letter. Budgets were slashed. Civil servant salaries were frozen. VAT rose on daily necessities. Healthcare subsidies vanished. There were no public forums, no citizen consultations, no national dialogue, just policies and consequences. And the streets of Nairobi erupted. Nurses, teachers, civil servants, once quiet, now thundered with anger. The police, already stripped of dignity and delayed in pay, had spoken first. Now the rest of society followed. And how did the government respond? Not with understanding, not with reform, but with tear gas, riot shields, and silence. Meanwhile, across the continent, Burkina Faso faced its own crisis: rising costs, drought, and a tightening national budget. But the response there was different. But Captain Ibrahim Traore didn't reach for the usual crutch. Instead of turning to the IMF, he turned to his people. What followed wasn't a bailout, it was a gathering. In the dusty center of Ouagadougou, under tin roofs and palm shade, he brought together a national forum not of elites, but of farmers, midwives, students, traders, and elders. Every voice counted, every question was welcome. And the question that bound them all was as simple as it was honest. If we must tighten our belts, where should we start? And who should we protect first? There were no grand promises, no flashy 5-year plans, just something rare or unfiltered trust. And what happened next felt almost miraculous. In Yako, a farmer donated 3 hectares for food cooperatives. In Toma, an electrician repaired a long-defunct power station, bringing electricity back to an entire village. In Fada Nguma, teachers held night classes by lamplight, brick by brick, school by school, station by station, a nation quietly began rebuilding itself. Not through loans, not under conditions, but with belief. The latest news about Captain Ibrahim isn't just about what he rejected, it's about what he sparked: a shift from resistance to responsibility. Meanwhile, in Nairobi, the headlines told a different story. Inflation surged past 20%. Public transport broke down. Fuel prices soared. Food became unaffordable. Civil society groups formed financial justice commissions, demanding clarity around Kenya's $9 billion IMF deal. But the government didn't answer, it sent armored trucks. If true leadership is tested in times of scarcity, then these two stories offer a stark contrast. One leader imposed sacrifice without asking. The other asked before acting. One silenced opposition, the other sat in the middle of it. One demanded obedience, the other inspired dignity. In Burkina Faso University, students launched a campaign called We Are the Plan B. Their message was clear. If no help comes from abroad, then let the youth become the solution. They offered free tutoring, launched mobile health clinics, textbooks no one told them to, and what's more, the government didn't stop them. Now compare that to Nairobi, where students protesting tuition hikes were arrested, teachers asking for basic supplies were branded enemies of progress, and youth calling for transparency were accused of inciting unrest. Two countries, same continent. Two crises, but one sparked hope and the other, fatigue. What does it say about power when silence has to be enforced? And what does it say about people when action rises, not from orders, but from belief? The latest headlines from Burkina Faso aren't about foreign credit ratings. They're about something much rarer. A people rising not to protest, but to participate. Choosing to act because, finally, someone chose to listen. If you believe this is the Africa we've been waiting for, say amen in the comments. Because maybe the revolution doesn't begin with elections. Maybe it begins the moment people stop waiting and start building. Just weeks after Captain Ibrahim announced the expansion of Burkina Faso's land reform program, a bold initiative to return idle land to community farmers, the response from global financial institutions came fast and quietly, not through open discussion or negotiation, but through spreadsheets and subtle punishment. In early May, 3 major credit agencies simultaneously downgraded Burkina Faso, their reasoning, political uncertainty, lack of fiscal compliance, and declining investor confidence. These weren't just observations, they were signals. By the end of the month, wire transfers to several public institutions were abruptly frozen. 2 major aid packages were quietly suspended without explanation. And the headlines began to echo: Burkina Faso risks isolation. Foreign investors pull out, but inside the country, people knew what it really meant. Captain Ibrahim Traore's refusal to comply with IMF demands didn't just cause diplomatic tension, it triggered something deeper, a financial siege. Universities felt it first. At the University of Ouagadougou, long dependent on European grants, an official notice arrived: funding was terminated, effective immediately. The reason? Curriculum was said to no longer meet global standards, but the students and faculty understood the subtext. Their course content hadn't changed. Their government had many countries. That kind of funding loss would shut down departments, cancel lectures, maybe close entire campuses, but not in Burkina Faso. Instead, professors climbed rooftops and gathered beneath trees, scribbling equations and ideas onto salvaged chalkboards. They taught in daylight when power was unavailable. They taught without pay, powered instead by conviction. In one engineering class, senior students stepped up to teach incoming freshmen, guiding them through design theory and soil mechanics like mentors passing a torch. In Kaya, farmers transformed their storage sheds into weekend classrooms. They taught kids from memory and experience, not from imported books. Lessons on identifying healthy soil, reading the sky for rainfall, and running a village market. In Tankaho, mothers turned market ledgers into reading material, prayer songs, but became literacy tools. In Gawa, blacksmiths held teen workshops on repairing tools and shaping metal, skills once dismissed as irrelevant to modern education. No government official told them to do this. There were no incentives, no instructions. But no one waited. They didn't rally outside embassies or demand a return of foreign grants. Instead, they rewrote education from the ground up. It became something more than a state function. It became a form of resistance, a way to restore identity and soul. One mother asked why she was teaching algebra to her neighbor's children while schools were shut. Said, because numbers can defend us too. And maybe she was right. The country had been attacked with numbers, downgrades, deficits, disappearing aid. But it answered back with its own numbers multiplication tables. Literacy rates, voltage calculations reclaimed, repurposed, and used as tools of awareness. In a world where control often comes disguised as compliance, Burkina Faso found a way to resist without raising its voice. No slogans, no flags, no riots. Just knowledge shared, freely and fearlessly. They didn't ask whether their version of education was certified. They simply passed it on, farmer to child, engineer to peer, elder to anyone willing to listen. When a nation loses funding but not faith, it finds new ways to grow. They couldn't stop the people, so they tried to stop the credit. But even under financial siege, the people didn't fall. They rose, one chalkboard, one lesson, one village at a time. It was a silent uprising, not built with fury, but with courage. By mid-July, the unrest in Kenya had reached a boiling point. It wasn't just on the streets, it had seeped into schools, hospitals, and campuses. Teachers walked out to protest unpaid wages. Nurses staged vigils in front of shuttered clinics. University students occupied lecture halls, demanding answers about the IMF's $9 billion loan. The streets no longer belonged to the government, they belonged to the people. What started with junior police officers stripping off their badges had swelled into a national wave of defiance. But this wave didn't build, it broke. It shattered trust. It drowned communication. It washed away hope. Each chant echoed with exhaustion. Each protest exposed the widening gulf between policy and lived reality. In Nairobi, posters read, "We are not poor, we are punished." On a concrete wall near Parliament, a student scrawled, "Debt is the new dictator." The slogans carried power, but the silence from leadership was louder. President William Ruto, once praised as a pragmatic technocrat, now stood accused of surrendering the economy to external masters. His speeches on fiscal discipline rang hollow in a country where bread had doubled in price, where electricity was rationed, and where teachers hadn't been paid in months. And then word began to spread not through TV or newspapers, but through WhatsApp groups, Telegram channels, and Pan-African radio. In Bobodu Lasso, a group of young engineers had brought 10 idle farming machines back to life using spare parts and shared skill. They didn't rely on manuals only, on wisdom passed down through generations. In Wahiga, women came together to form baking cooperatives, using local grains to reduce dependency on costly imports. In Gawa, volunteers ran nighttime radio lessons for rural children, blending stories, songs, and riddles to make learning come alive. No one gave them orders. No one promised rewards or threatened punishment. They acted because someone had listened. Captain Ibrahim Traore didn't issue commands. He sparked inspiration. And when people feel truly seen and part of something real, they don't wait to be told what to do, they begin. There were no marches, no slogans, no fires, but there was movement, the kind that quietly transforms a nation. The real difference between these two countries, both facing harsh economic challenges, wasn't about policies, it was about participation. In Kenya, people felt shut out. In Burkina Faso, they felt welcomed. And that shift changed everything. When women in Tankogo bake bread from millet instead of wheat, it's not just about saving money, it's about reclaiming independence. When students trade flashcards and teach each other, it's not about making do, it's about laying the foundation for something stronger. And when farmers swap imported fertilizers for compost, it's not rejection of the modern world, it's defining it for themselves. This isn't about blind hope, it's about ownership. In Kenya, anger rose because people felt ignored. In Burkina Faso, action spread because people knew they were being heard. And now, a powerful question echoes across the continent. What lasts longer, resistance born from rage, or responsibility born from awakening? Both nations stood at the same fork in the road, yet the paths they chose couldn't look more different. In Kenya, the streets filled with protest sand, the silence from leadership deepened the despair. Trust cracked under the pressure of unpaid salaries and distant decisions. Teachers stopped teaching, nurses left empty clinics. Students replaced books with protest signs. It wasn't just about policy, it was about feeling invisible. Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, something quieter took hold. No rallies, no chants, just people building, repairing, teaching, not because they were promised anything but because someone believed they were already enough. Captain Traore didn't offer miracles. He offered belief. And belief, once planted, grows faster than aid ever can. Here lies the final contrast. A people driven by lost hope versus a people moved by newfound trust. And it leaves the continent and its leaders with questions that can't be ignored. Can education rooted in necessity outlast degrees paid for by loans? Can listening communities speak louder than orders refused? And most importantly, will Africa rise because it was told to war, because its people chose to rise? If you've ever asked what kind of leadership Africa truly needs, a polished speaker behind a podium or a quiet man walking barefoot among the people, think of Traore. Think of Ruto, and then ask yourself, where does your trust belong? I want to hear from you. What do you feel when you compare these two paths? What does it mean for your family, your children, your future? Share your thoughts. And if you believe in this new kind of revolution, say it out loud. Write it. Share it. If this story stirred something in your heart, don't scroll past like it. Share it. Speak it. Because they've hidden our history for too long. It's time to speak our future into being. Thank you for listening. We'll see you in the next story.